Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can we please ensure that all electronic devices are switched to silent? This morning we've received apologies from Elena Whittam, Emma Roddick and Beatrice Wishart, so we're somewhat depleted, but please don't feel that's a reflection on the quality of the panel we've had this morning. It reminds me of a story of once turning up at a village hall in the Borders to do a burnt supper, and there was nobody there. And I asked the chairman whether he'd told anybody that I was speaking, and he said no, but it must have got out. Anyway, our first item on the agenda is consideration of whether to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are we agreed? Thank you. Our next item on the agenda is an evidence session on the climate transition for Scottish agriculture. This will be the first of 2 meetings excuse me, where the committee will be discussing this issue as part of our pre-legislative scrutiny on the climate change plan. So this morning I'm pleased to say that we're joined by a panel of 5 stakeholders from the farming sector. So before we begin, I'd like to start the meeting by inviting all the participants to introduce themselves and briefly tell us about your background. And we kick off with Johnny Hall.
Good morning, convener. Good morning, committee. My name is Johnny Hall. I'm Deputy CEO and Director of Policy with NFU Scotland. And I guess in terms of background, I've been dealing with agricultural policy for over 40 years, and 27 of which in Scotland. And certainly over the last few years, dealing and wrestling with how we transition away from the CAP and deliver a fit and bespoke agricultural support system for farming and crofting in Scotland, which obviously entails how we continue to produce high-quality food, but also tackle the issues around climate, nature and underpinning our rural communities.
Thank you. Pete Ritchie.
Hi, I'm Pete Ritchie. I'm Director of Nourish Scotland, which is a food policy organisation, and a member of ARIOB. I also spent 20-odd years running a mixed organic farm in the Borders.
Thank you. Kate Rowell.
Good morning. I'm Kate Rowell. I'm Chair of Quality Meat Scotland, which is the Red Meat Levy Board for Scotland. I've been Chair for just over 6 years. I'm also a sheep and beef farmer from just outside Peebles in the Borders, where I've been farming all my life, and I am also a vet. And I did sit on the first Just Transition Commission, which looked at the transition from a fairness point of view.
Thank you. Jim Walker.
Good morning, I'm Jim Walker. I'm a former NFU president, I think maybe about 20 or 30 years ago. Former QMS chairman about 25 years ago. I sat as the chair of a suckler cow group when Fergus Ewan was the Cabinet Secretary, looking at ways of making suckler cow and beef production in Scotland more efficient and more sustainable. That's 5 years ago now, committee, which is quite interesting. Life's moved on in some ways quite a lot, but in other ways not at all since then. So other than that, I'm not entirely sure why I've been asked to come this morning, but I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Neil Wilson.
Neil Wilson, good morning, convener and committee. Neil Wilson, I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Auctioneers and Appraisals in Scotland, as well as the Chair of the Food and Agricultural Stakeholders Task Force group. I have spent a lifetime in the industry, but before I moved into my current role, I was the Head of Agriculture for HSBC Bank, so I spent 23 years in banking before then. And I have a small family farm in Dumfriesshire as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to say we've got approximately 90 minutes for questions this morning. And just remind you, you'll not need to operate your own mics. We've got somebody who'll do that for you. So I'll kick off. Just to get a broad understanding of what the feeling is within stakeholders, can you tell us whether you believe that subsidy control schemes that have been initiated through the Agriculture and Rural Communities Act, whether they've made any difference and whether they're going to effectively support emissions reductions in farming and crofting across Scotland? You'd like to kick off?
Question that you referred to convener as subsidy control schemes?
Sorry, it's just subsidy schemes, not subsidy control.
Subsidy Control Act is something else, and I was wondering where we're going with that.
Well, we might well be later on.
Which is an issue in itself, yeah, I agree. Obviously, I think, you know, as Jim Walker's just referred to, some things have changed and some things absolutely haven't. And where we are now within Scottish agriculture in terms of delivering support payments, I'd rather call them support payments and investment rather than subsidies, is that we are still very much operating under the legacy CAP, Common Agricultural Policy schemes, particularly around basic payment scheme and greening elements, and obviously coupled support, very important for the suckler beef sector, but also for hill sheep. And obviously things like the Less Favoured Area Support Scheme. They're the main principal support schemes that we operate in Scotland. We're still pretty much operating those under the rules and compliance issues that we inherited from the CAP. That was transferred into Scottish law under the Agriculture EU Retained Law and Data Act of 2020. And we might have the Agricultural Rural Communities Act 2024, but as of yet, those powers have yet to be used in any meaningful way whatsoever. We're still operating under legacy schemes. So in that sense, Convener, I don't think we have made significant progress at all in utilising the powers that are now at the disposal of Scottish Government in any way to either accelerate our journey to a more efficient, more productive agricultural system that delivers on food, climate and biodiversity. We are still, if you like, in a bit of a limbo situation. Now, in some ways, that offers some comfort for some, in the sense that there's a degree of certainty around those schemes, there's a degree of understanding. Farmers and crofters have been operating under BPS and greening and LFAS, etc., for some time. There's a familiarity to that. But nevertheless, I think we need to move forward with a degree of pace, because, as we know, the expectations on the agricultural sector to deliver not only on food production but also on climate and biodiversity are increasing all the time. And the agricultural sector cannot do that unless it's enabled to, with the financial underpinning it is required, as well as a regulatory framework which allows it to prosper.
Very much agree with Johnny on that. We are in a holding pattern, and we have been for some time. And one of the frustrations we have at Nourish is that the plans for the four-tier scheme, Tier 2 was expected to do the heavy lifting, and we were told for a very long time that Tier 2 would be the thing which helped farmers deliver for climate and nature. And we were expecting a big bang, and we've got a very small squeak at the moment, partly because of the computer problems, partly because of the inability to actually come up with, we had some good measures in earlier documents, but we haven't really come up with a coherent way to help farmers reduce their emissions through the subsidy scheme. And we'll probably come to this later, but I think one of our concerns too is that Tier 4, which is seen as the icing on the cake, you know, there's a sort of wedding cake idea of this, and that Tier 4 is the small bit at the top of the cake. But actually, if you want to do change, investing in advice and skills and knowledge transfer and knowledge exchange is the first thing you do, not the last thing you do. And that's been a real weakness of the strategy so far.
Thank you. Kate?
Yeah, I think there is a real lack of certainty out there amongst farmers. They don't know what's coming. They're being told constantly that change is coming. There will be a transition, but for many of them on the ground, they don't know what that means. And what that really results in, and has resulted in for quite a few years now, is a lack of investment, because people are holding off. They're waiting to see what's going to happen next. It's also resulted in a lack of confidence for the future. So one of the big concerns in the sector is succession, is the lack of younger people coming into the sector, and that lack of confidence doesn't help that situation. If you've got youngsters at home who don't really know what they want to do next and are withering, if the confidence isn't there for how the future is going to pan out, then you're not going to encourage them into the farming business. So I think it's that real lack of certainty and lack of confidence that has been an issue in the most recent years, and we need to change that as soon as we can.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, it's quite interesting as a semi-layman in this and a semi-retired farmer. My son does the farming, or one of my sons does the farming now, to hear commentators talking about climate emergencies, and we have been now for probably nearly 10 years, but certainly for the last 5. I was always of the opinion in other walks of life that I was involved in, that if there was an emergency, people reacted to it quickly. That's certainly not been the case here. If you look at the trends of what's happened in agriculture in the UK, or particularly in Scotland, over the last 20-30 years, the cattle numbers in Scotland, and I was involved in the beef report, as you know, have dropped significantly. There was 2.68 million cattle in the UK in 1974. Now there's 1.68. There's only 180,000 dairy cows left in Scotland and 380,000 beef cows, down from 500,000 beef cows less than 20 years ago. We are less than 60% self-sufficient in food in the UK, whereas in the 80s we were nearly 80% self-sufficient, which is quite interesting when you look at what's going on around the world right now, both in terms of war, political instability, and now trade wars across the planet, with tariffs being introduced in the US. And here we are still talking about a climate emergency. The lack of coherent agricultural policy in Scotland has held the industry back. And the way that subsidies have been handled have fallen into the same trap, partly because of what Johnny said earlier. The way of delivering the support payments to agriculture is just not fit for purpose. The computer system is knackered, and has been knackered for years, been held together by blue tack and sticky tape since I can remember, and that's still the case.
Just on that, and I know Pete also touched on it, we questioned officials last month about issues potentially holding back policy due to computer system not being able to deal with it. Is that a real significant factor in moving forward?
It's 100% a real significant factor. It was a real significant factor when we wrote a report, and I circulated not just the report but the implementation, and Neil was involved at the time, NFU were involved at the time, QMS were involved at the time, about how you would actually enact the beef report and put it into some coherent strategy for the industry that could actually be transferred over into the industry and get the farming sector involved, or the beef sector involved. And one of the main things we had to be involved in, working with officials, was that we could actually find a route to deliver whatever the changes might be over a period of time. And one of the huge drawbacks and difficulties then was how it fitted into a computer system. This is 5 years ago, remember, Convener, so God knows what it looks like now, that was actually able to deliver money on time into the sector. And we managed to do that using existing schemes, and it could still be done. But 5 years down the track, other than spending money trying to keep it alive and keep paying farmers on time, in inverted commas, that's all that it's managed to do. But in answer to your question about subsidies, there's lots of talk about how much money is invested in agriculture through support payments. But just for the committee's benefit, because you're not all as old as me, I was in the NFU President's Chair in 2001 when LFA support replaced the former HLCA scheme for hill and upland farmers, which is a lifeline payment for most hill farms around Scotland. I was looking back my notes when I saw I was coming to this, and the payment in 2002 was 62 million quid. The payment in 2024 was 63 million quid. So that's the money that was actually passed to agriculture. If you compound interest that from 2021 to 2024, that should have been £130 million to keep track with inflation, never mind anything else. Can anybody in this committee or anywhere else tell me any government agency, any government department that's worked with zero inflation, with zero increases in real term spending over the last 25 years? There's not one single welfare, health, defence, anything to do with either Scottish or UK politics has been frozen at 2021 levels for the last 25 odd years, but agriculture has. So not only the delivery mechanism for support payments, Convener, not only the way that support payments are still in the dark ages because we're still working under some illusion that we're going to be part of Europe again someday, but thirdly, because they're actually in real terms cut to buggery for the last 20 odd years.
Yeah. I've got Emma Harper's got a supplementary on this.
Just to come back to Jim on the reduction in beef cattle, what is the reason for that? Because I think the climate emergency was declared in 2019, April 2019, but you're saying the reduction in beef cattle was since 2012. So is there more than one different reason for why we have a reduced beef cattle? Is it a global thing? Is it just local to Scotland? What's going on?
The The main reason goes back into the 1990s, and probably before that, but certainly the 1990s, mid-1990s, for those of you that remember, we had the BSE crisis. We were banned from export markets for 10 years. The UK beef industry then fell into the clutches of Irish meat processors supplying the multiple retail sector in the UK. And they dominated that trade, and because beef farming or producing beef cattle wasn't profitable, farmers voted with their feet. Add to that layers and layers of regulation, particularly around environmental issues, slurry control, etc., and you've got an unprofitable sector. It's only in the last 12 months that we've started to emerge from the shadow of that, and the multiple retail sector doesn't have control over the beef industry in the UK anymore, or in Scotland, and it certainly doesn't have control in the sheep sector and hasn't had for COVID. And as a result, you've seen an increase of between 30% and 40% in the value of those products, and a massive increase in demand, despite some of the wild accusations and wild requests from the Climate Change Committee and other interest groups that want us to see us eating and producing less beef. The reality is the demand for beef has never been better, both at home and in export markets, and there are few choices around the world. The cattle inventory, Emma, for example, in the US, is at its lowest level since 1949, and most countries around the world are in a similar position. Europe is the smallest cattle herd it's had in my lifetime. So the old adage of supply and demand is kicking in. Farmers have voted with their feet because they didn't make money, and more recently there's been no policy lead whatsoever from the Scottish Government, so they've put cattle off. And those of us that have been either daft enough or clever enough, depends which side of the fence you're on, to stick with it, have seen prices that we could only have dreamed of. I was at a meeting with Kate in 2020, which was the start of the reason to write our report and the reason Fergus kicked it in. It's still an auction mark in the spring of 2020, and deadweight cattle prices on that day were £3 a kilo. This week they're nearly £7, and that's only 5 years ago.
Let Neil come in, because he'll have a take on this as well, but just to give him his tuppence worth, the first question, and then I've got Kate and Johnny.
Yeah, so back to your first question, I don't think I can disagree with anything that's been put there. What I would layer on top of that is that some of the conditionality that's come in that really kind of feels quite ineffective to me as well, and actually becomes almost more of a barrier. And I think, certainly in the Scottish Suckler Beef Support Scheme, I was and the Institute Auctioneers were pushing back pretty hard on that in terms of conditionality coming in there for some sort of environmental gain, which wasn't clear. So I think kind of everybody else's point is there or thereabouts for me, but then some of the dabbling that's went on, whole farm plans, things like that, I just, for the majority of farm businesses, I'm struggling to see any great value in that, other than a sort of another barrier, another frustration there. Now, if that's all going to be built on in future, then there might be some reason to do that, but as others on the panel have said, we've absolutely no clarity on what that looks like. And I think on Emma's question about beef numbers, I think Jim nailed it, and what we're absolutely seeing, and certainly in the last 3 months, but over the past 12 months, is a full reaction now to, despite what climate change committees and co might say about reducing consumption, actually we're seeing, broadly consumption increase, and I'm sure Kate can talk a bit more about that. But we do not have the supply there to meet the demand, and the supply there is now not there globally. There is an opportunity here for the daft ones like Jim, who stuck in with beef cattle, to actually make a good return here, despite there being virtually no policy direction for them to follow.
Okay, thank you. Kate and then Johnny.
Really, just to back up what Jim was saying there about demand, we are seeing strong demand all around the world. Back in October, we had a stand over at a big trade show called CIAL in Paris, We had processors there. And for the first time, the people coming onto the stand looking to secure supply were not talking about price at all. They were talking about supply and availability. And unfortunately, a lot of our processors were having to say we can't fulfil that because we don't have enough product. We don't have enough Scotch beef or Scotch lamb. Scotch beef more because the cattle herd has declined much faster than the sheep flock. Also, we've spent many years trying to build up premium food service markets in London. So, you know, we have restaurants down there, high-profile restaurants, who now ask for Scotch beef as a matter of course because they know it's the best they can get. And unfortunately, they are now having to turn to alternatives because it's very, very difficult for them to get enough. And it's really disappointing when you have that demand out there, and it's so frustrating that we can't supply that. So we have done some work just recently. I mean, Jim's talked longer term there, but we've done some work recently on why people in the past few years have gone out of cattle production. And number one is the profitability of the business. That's been what's driven everything. But there are other things in there as well. People want a different kind of work-life balance. The cost of labour is very difficult, and labour availability is difficult as well. There's not enough people out there with the skills. Succession's an issue, as I've said, getting the younger people who are actually born and bred on the farm to stay there. And basically, farmers are getting older. Average farmer age is getting older. It's more difficult physically to deal with cattle than it is to deal with sheep. So often the choice has been, I'll stay on the farm, but I'll get rid of the cattle because it's more expensive and it's harder on my body. So there's a lot of reasons there. And yeah, it's been said already about the lack of certainty about where we're going. We would love to see some sort of vision for livestock production in Scotland. We've got a vision for agriculture. We'd love to see a vision for livestock production. It's something the EU are doing at the moment, apparently, is they're looking at a specific livestock vision. So it would be good to get that same vision from the Scottish Government.
Thank you. Johnny.
Thanks, Convener. Just to add to the commentary that's already been made about the supply and demand issues and what an impact that has had, particularly on the beef sector, but also other sectors as well. Over recent times, I would add that probably the most significant and marked decline in suckler beef numbers, and particularly in sheep numbers, was when in 2005, when we moved from essentially a headage-based system under the CAP, suckler cow premium, sheep annual premium payments, etc., to the single farm payment scheme, which was a decoupled system. So that effectively fossilised the support payments that went to individual businesses, and there was no connection whatsoever between how many cattle or sheep were held and managed on particular businesses. So the support payment was completely divorced from the agricultural activity or the production of the farm in many respects. And that also transferred across into things like the cereal sector as well, and so on. So that happened in 2005. So we fossilised payments, and I remember SAC at the time, writing a report called Retreat from the Hills in those sort of 2006, 7, 8 years, which set out in stark terms the impacts of declining livestock numbers in remoter areas of Scotland as a consequence of decoupled payments. You then fast forward to 2013, and it didn't kick in until 2014-15, which was the next reform of the CAP, which not only continued the decoupling of payments, but instead of just being fossilised, it then flattened those payments. So we had flat rates across 3 different payment regions, which again bore no reflection whatsoever in terms of the agricultural activity. So we disconnected the support payment going into an agricultural business from the agricultural activity, other than the bits and pieces around things like the couple support scheme for the suckler beef herd, which we introduced initially in 2005, and then we reinvented in 2013-14. But that did little more than slow the decline rather than flattening out or even reversing it, because it just didn't stack up. I think the point that Kate made also about labour and the profile of those who are engaged in suckler beef production in Scotland, not only on farm but through the processing sector, I think is significant as well. You know, suckler beef are a pretty labour-intensive agricultural sector, probably the most labour-intensive. So as well as rising costs in other ways, you've got to then look at the profile of the people who are actually involved in this and whether people are willing to do this anymore, given the returns at best.
Okay, Pete.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, There's a lot of wishful thinking here from the livestock sector, okay? So demand for beef and lamb fell sharply after 2019. Last year, beef demand went up 0.4%, hardly a huge increase in demand. And as the UK Climate Change Committee shows, consumption is going below trend of what's predicted to meet our climate targets. The UK is overall 60-70% sufficient food. In beef, it's 87% self-sufficient. In lamb, it's 106% self-sufficient. So, we don't need to produce an enormous amount more beef to feed the UK population. And what we're going to see is that consumption and production will fall, as they have done in line over a number of years. The question is, has the government got a plan for how to manage this in a way that's fair for farmers, that's good for communities, as Johnny says, that actually keeps rural communities going, and that reduces emissions? We're off track on emissions reduction. We should be at 6.8. That was last year. The government brought out a tracking thing on agriculture climate change emissions. We should have been at 6.8 megatons. We're at 7.8 megatons. And the reduction in emissions came from reduction in use of nitrogen fertilizer, primarily, which was caused by the price spike and not by policy interventions. And if you look at emissions intensity in the beef sector over the last 30 years, and pick up Jim's point about flatlining, 4% reduction in emission over 30 years in emissions intensity. In other words, in efficiency of production. So, yes, there's lots of different moving parts to this. And what we want to keep saying is the government needs to have a plan agreed with the sector on what's going to happen. I think everybody's in agreement with that. But we can't just hope that it's going to sort itself out. Because what happens when it just sorts itself out is the market takes over. Retailers have got commitments to reduce emissions in the UK shopping basket significantly before 2030. And they will start to be demanding emissions intensity numbers, just as they already do in the dairy industry. They'll start to be demanding that with beef and sheep. And if you can't show that your emissions intensity is below a certain level, then you will lose out. And producers will go out of business because they can't sell their produce anymore. And the Irish, as we've heard before, have been on this for 30 years. And they've been producing those emissions numbers, and they've been making their case to the retailers, and that's why they've been doing better.
Okay. We have moved slightly off topic, but I thought I'd let everybody kind of set the scene for this. We are trying to focus on the transition to a more climate-friendly agriculture, so we'll try and pull it back on track. And it's a question relating to the role of the farmer-led groups and just how effective those farmer-led groups have been in, changing Scottish Government policy. So can I ask, and I'm maybe going to start with Jim, because you were the very much involved in one of the farmer-led groups. Can you provide examples of where your group's recommendations have actually successfully been integrated into Scottish Government policy? And if it hasn't, where has that whole process failed?
How long have we got, Convener? So back in 2020 when this started, the idea of the first farmer-led group was cobbled up between a previous Cabinet Secretary, Mr Ewing, and myself. And at that time I was into bat for Scottish Government to try and get convergence funding returned to Scotland after 6 years of arami between most people, to be fair. We were successful in that. We were also successful in getting funding that was then described as BEW funding. Paul Bew was the chairman of the committee I sat on that allowed that to happen. 25 or 6 million a year, which still exists, although I note from afar that mostly it doesn't get spent in agriculture anymore. It gets hived off into other things, but that's an aside for another day. The idea was that I set up this group, and I agreed to do the BEW thing on the proviso that we set up a group not of the normal suspects that appear at committees like this, but of young farmers, all under 40, that I handpicked, that had a future in the industry and were interested in being able to farm without subsidies, interestingly. That was the remit of the group at the time. So we were looking at ways of how we could make beef production in Scotland more efficient with a new audience in the room, young people that had their future in the industry and were committed to the industry. it became clear as we went through that process that the kind of things that we were coming up with, the ideas that they were coming up with and we were coming up with, could be transferred across all sectors. And that's why farmer-led groups spread from the beef sector in the first instance across dairy into arable, etc., and then uplands after that. The LFA situation is slightly more complicated because it's more of as much a social issue as it is an agricultural issue. So that's how it started. We then put together an implementation group, and just for the committee's knowledge or recollection, the recommendations from the Suckler report that we wrote were then put into the programme for government for this government in the back end of 2020. So 5 years ago, come October, come September, it was announced in this building that there would be a Suckler beef scheme to make sustainable and efficient beef production, climate-friendly beef production, part of government policy or government regulation from the spring of 2021 onwards. And here we are. This that I circulated through Ben to the committee yesterday is how that committee report that I chaired would have been implemented. And there are people, as I said earlier, in this room who were involved in that. We also involved the people who ran in Scottish Government, who ran the computer system, knowing that was a massive weakness and an Achilles heel then. We also had former Scottish Government employees, civil servants on the group who understood how it worked. We also looked at WTO compliance, we also looked at CAP compliance, we looked at compliance with DEFRA regulations as well. So we were serious about implementing that Suckler plan, and it was, as you will see in here, it was supposed to go from 2022 to 2032. So it was a 10-year transition from where we were then to where we hope to be in 2032 to try and meet some of the climate targets that this government is tied to. Unfortunately, in the excitement of the spring of 2021, the Cabinet Secretary was thrown off the bus, somebody else came on board, and a new committee was set up that I have no part in whatsoever, but it seems to go round and round the mulberry bush and not achieve very much. What I find interesting and actually quite insulting as the chairman of that group, with all the commitments we got at the very highest level of government in those days, both the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister signed up to this. One of them is still in position, one of them is not. Is now that we hear that, for example, the 410-day calving interval rule that's coming in this year to allow people to claim under the beef calf scheme is because it was in our report. The whole farm plan that Neil referred to was because it was in our report. The report was 40,000 pages. It was 40,000 pages, and it was full of ideas that were carrot and stick. The idea was to take a proportion of the BEW money that was consistent with the emissions that were supposed to be from the beef herd, around 60% of emissions from Scottish agriculture, at least back then. It will be less now because there's less beef cattle. That money was supposed to be there as the incentive to get farmers involved. If you start preaching to farmers and tell them what they're going to have to do, you get a situation like now where something as irrelevant as the 410-day rule as a standalone policy or standalone idea creates the mayhem that it's created over the last few months. If you take farmers with you and explain to them that A, it can be done, show them through a network of farms that Kate's organisation and others currently run, monitor farms, prove that other farmers can do it, so can they. Allow farmers at different stages of the development on the ladder that they're on, of their technical capability and their ability to understand that being more efficient creates reductions in emissions at the same time, and I'll give you an example of this in a minute. Then that would have taken the farming industry or the beef sector, and dairy and arable are no different, it would have taken them, us, with government. The government chose to do it a completely different way, stick their head in the sand and do nothing for 4 years. And then, in a blind panic to do something, threw out a couple of ideas and then said it was because it came from the farmer-led groups. It's poor, it's insulting. That's not what we planned. It's not what this piece of paper says. So I can't give you any examples from the farmer-led groups, convener, where there has been any positive benefit from what we propose through government policy.
Thank you. Kate, you were also involved in one of these groups. What's your view on how they worked and how effective they've been in forming policy?
So yeah, I was on the Sheep and Upland group, and as Jim says, it was slightly different in that it was not necessarily looking at all the same things as the productivity focus in the other groups. But there were a lot of recommendations that came from all the groups, and I also sit on the ARIOB. These came through the ARIOB as a list of measures, distilled, obviously not in exactly the way that they were written in the original reports, but you can see that they did follow through. But unfortunately, back to the computer system, there does not seem to be any way to implement this list of measures. So although there are some things like the basis of the whole farm plan was actually proposed, I think you proposed it in a much more organised way and much more of it, but the bare bones of it did come from your work, but it's nowhere near the amount that you did propose. And apart from that, the list of measures, as I say, you can follow back to the farmer groups, but they aren't doing anything at the minute. They're just sitting there.
Okay, Johnny.
Yeah, just to concur with Kate's comments there, very much so. I mean, there were 5 farmer-led groups, obviously the Suckler Beef one that Jim chaired, the Hill and Upland one, including crofting that Kate sat on, but there was also one for arable, chaired by Andrew Moyer, one for dairy with Sarah Bradburn and Jackie McCreary leading on that, and one for pigs, Andy McGowan. So representing a significant swathe of Scottish agriculture, not every sector, obviously. And clearly, each and every one of those reports came up with some significant recommendations under the impression that those recommendations would be taken forward. And particularly, as Kate says, some of the elements that were then essentially going to feed into the construction of the new Tier 2 under the new 4-tier system of conditional measures, if you like, actions that farmers and crofters could take. That was the premise on which that was built. So I think the whole industry was thinking, yes, this is the new bit. This is the difference. We'll still have a basic payment scheme of sorts in the new Tier 1, but the new bit, the actions-based, which will allow individuals to drive efficiency from a menu of options, something for each and every farm and croft, regardless of size, type or location. That was the philosophy, that was the thought, that was what was essentially sold to us. It's only in the last sort of 18 months or so that the biggest constraining factor on the advancement of that, and it's already been referred to, is the IT system. It is currently undeliverable. Therefore, for the foreseeable future, we are operating under what is effectively a rollover of the basic payment scheme and essentially greening, which is again that additional component of the basic payment scheme, and that's going to become our new Tier 1 and Tier 2. Yes, there'll be some tweaks around the edges, but for the foreseeable future, probably till 28, 29 at best, it's kind of business as usual. And therefore, as Kate said earlier on, people are sitting on their hands thinking, what do I do? Do I commit and invest now, knowing things that might change in the future? Or do I sit tight? And too many folk are actually just sitting tight, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move... Pete?
Yeah, probably just slightly different, but we worked with the NFU Scotland on the Farming for 1.5 report at a similar sort of time. And I think I'd concur with a lot of things people said. One of the key recommendations about that was about having a theory of change, and it was about how you work with the sector. And as Johnny said, it took place where everybody has to do something, and there's something for everybody in the change process. And I think this whole bit about trying to manage the change process in a way that builds consensus, builds buy-in, just like Jim saying, you get people on board, and I don't know why we haven't managed to do that. And there's examples of other places where I think they've been a bit more effective in doing that.
Yeah, I'm very conscious of time, but Neil, I'll let you come in this before we move on to our next question. So a lot of it appears to be around co-design. We hear that co-design is the centre of all government policy making. From what you're saying, that doesn't seem to be the situation. Neil, from FAS's point of view, is that something that's a concern to you?
I think it's been a significant concern. When the farmer-led groups were there, I think there was a broad confidence that as an industry that there was an opportunity to move forward, and there was an opportunity to work with government, to create new policies, to bring the industry with us. That was lost pretty rapidly, and I've been on record a number of times, been pretty critical of co-design or co-development from an industry perspective. Now, that might just be a misunderstanding in terms of what we feel as an industry broadly looks like as co-development versus what government might look at as co-development. But there are through the family-led groups all the way through to now, ARIOB, other committees that go on, government has absorbed a massive amount of industry time and investment and knowledge, and does not appear to have taken very much of that on board or moved forward with it. And I would say generally, but for those that don't know, FAST is a sort of organisation of organisations. We've got 16 agricultural and food organisations as part of that. And I would say, generally speaking, around the table, that is a frustration. And it is probably one of the main reasons FAST was started in September 2022, convener, because that frustration was just building and building. Now, it's taken us a long time to move forward now, but I would say that we are probably having a slightly more constructive dialogue with government over the last few months, but it's pretty slow progress.
Thank you. That takes us neatly on to questions from Rhoda Grant.
Yeah, so I've got questions about ARIOB, and I wonder if the panel could describe the process that ARIOB follows when advising the Scottish Government about climate change and net zero policy.
I'll kick off with that. I don't officially sit on ARIOB, but I do attend ARIOB meetings because I'm part of another subgroup called the Policy Development Group, which is there to put together policy proposals that would then be considered by ARIOB in terms of taking forward our transition away from the CAP to delivering a new system of support that delivers on the outcomes, essentially those 4 outcomes that are stated in the Agriculture and Rural Communities Scotland Act. I think my experience at the moment is that there's been a lot of discussion, but not a lot of conclusion in terms of how we actually do that. And the specific question about climate, I think is very much on the agenda, but there's very little direct relevance to saying, actually, what are the challenges and issues facing Scottish agriculture, and how can we shape and implement a new policy delivery mechanism that encourages and enables drivers of efficiency. We improve our sequestration of carbon in soils and peatlands and all the rest of it. And we also do a bit more around adaptation, because I think adaptation is going to be more and more of an important feature for Scottish agriculture going forward. So there is plenty of conversation, but not enough conclusion so far in terms of that process.
Can I just maybe ask about the process itself? So your working group feeds into ARIOB. Do they formally report back to government? You talk about a lot of discussion, but where does that go? How does it work? How does it feed back into government policy?
Well, I think others will also comment, but as things stand, ARIOB is made up of government and stakeholders. It is that oversight board that involves a number of individuals who are involved in the farmer-led groups and others who represent other interests, whether it's the environmental NGOs and others. Some academics in there as well. There's an academic advisory panel. And I suspect it's meant to be there as a sounding board, but it doesn't take decisions on actually policy implementation or policy options. At the moment, it feels very much that we talk around the edges of lots of things, but don't actually get to grips with decision-making whatsoever within that forum. So it might be about co-design in that sense, but it's certainly not about co-decision.
Okay. And
Kate?
Yes, Johnny, to put it very tactfully, it's certainly not about co-decision. It's been clear from the start it's not a decision-making forum. I think it's fair to say that we've spent a lot of time, and I've echoed Jim's point here, on really very small institutional issues within RPID, within the delivery bit, whether it's talking about the computer, whether it's talking about the very small details of tweaking the support scheme and the tiers. And the difficulty with that is that it gets you away from this bigger change picture that we're trying to work on, which is how can we have a profitable, thriving agricultural sector in Scotland that is delivering also for climate and nature. And that's been the big question for 5 years, and we haven't really come up with the sort of ways of talking about this that gets to yes on this. And as I said, other places I think have done a better job of bringing together the different sectors, the producers, but also the environmental interests, Nature's got people who are trying to look at the whole picture in other ways, but also the supply chain, which drives quite a lot of change, and they're not in the room at all. They're not seen as relevant to this process. So we're focusing a lot of discussion in ARIOB on the minutiae of the farm support schemes. And obviously people get very interested in that because it's their livelihoods and it's their money. But it's taken us away from thinking, how are we going to manage this change together to drive us to a situation where farming in Scotland is profitable, something people want to do, it's producing good food, but it's also delivering on our climate and nature obligations.
Yeah, I would just add that emphasise really that what happens at ARIOB is that agenda items are put forward. I think those are all in the public domain, minutes are as well. Things are discussed, everyone around the table gives their opinion, and at no point is any decision made by ARIOB on any of this. There's never been a vote or any sort of consensus being asked for. We feed back our opinion, and that's where it stops.
Can I just... We've had a number of statutory instruments from government quite recently, and when we're in the process of looking at them, passing them, we get feedback from the industry that they're not happy with this. And the Minister then, as Defence, says, well, this was all discussed and agreed at ARIOB. Why are people now complaining about something that they had full sight of and signed off? And that's, I guess, where we're trying to get to, is why that happens. Why do government think that ARIOB has signed things off? And why is the industry thinking that they're not being heard?
I suppose there is definitely no sign-off process. The term sign-off from ARIOB, that doesn't happen. They may have discussed a subject and got a broad consensus in the room that we agree with, that every sector agrees with that, which could be what's been referred to, but there is no sign-off process.
Let's be clear and let's be absolutely honest about this. ARIOB is a fig leaf for not doing anything. It's a way of pretending to engage with the industry and then do what you like and then pick bits from other reports. 1.5 degrees was a great report. Nigel Miller, you guys did a great report. We worked with that when we were doing it in our Suckler group. I spoke to Nigel many a time about what was important to try and get action, strategy, timetables and delivery with an outcome at the end. So everybody knows what the outcome is, but nobody knows the steps to get there. So ARIOB is 100% fig leaf. Part of that is probably my fault and probably Fergus's fault, because we had a different model when we did the Suckler group, which was not to have everybody in the room representing somebody. It was to look at not subsidy schemes, it was to look at how do we make the industry more sustainable, both from a profitability and from a climate perspective. That was our remit, and that's what we produced. Then you fit the support regime around that to help enable the delivery. That's been flipped totally in its head, because let's be honest, the civil service in agriculture is far more comfortable shoveling money out to farmers through simplistic schemes that they understand, whether the delivery mechanism through the computer system is fit for purpose or not. They always, Rhoda, you think of it, in our lifetimes, they have taken policy from Europe, they have enacted it into Scottish or British legislation, and then they have churned the money out the door on that basis. When it then came to a challenge like we gave them, with a delivery mechanism, which we could have worked through, even the computer system we've got, when we gave them that challenge, they didn't know what to do, because their ability to deliver and write policy is almost non-existent. Then the backstop is, oh, but the computer says no. So ARIOB is there as a fig leaf to do nothing. And the industry that I speak to, and I'm not in any committees anymore, thank goodness, but I speak to hundreds of farmers, I write stuff in the press all the time, Scotland and nationally, and the feedback I get is universal. You're saying the right thing because you're representing what we feel, and we feel completely disconnected from a government policy for agriculture that effectively doesn't exist.
Just about all of that in a slightly different way. And I think probably just to, you know, so I'm not an ARIOB, I've no desire to be an ARIOB. I've never been clear on what ARIOB is to achieve, and that's with the greatest respect to the people who are on it and given their time up. And again, I go back to that, you know, government absorbing a lot of knowledgeable time. But I think back to your original point, Rhoda, is why when an SI has been presented to then some of the actors in the industry come back and go, oh, hold on a minute. It's just a failure of co-development. It's got to be. Because actually, government are not fundamentally engaging with the whole sector. And Pete absolutely hit the nail on the head earlier on. The supply chain, which is massive, is not represented anywhere. The Institute of Auctioneers, meat wholesalers, AIC Scotland, other people involved. Massive employers drive a massive amount of value back to farm and through to consumer. Just cast aside. It's not important.
Yeah. So I suppose, can any of you name a tangible difference that has been made by ARIOB to policy direction?
No.
Completely with Jim here. You have to decide what you want to happen first, what a better future looks like, and then you design the subsidy schemes to deliver that. We're out of Europe. We can design the schemes we want. You don't start with subsidy schemes and then hope that's going to deliver the change.
And I think the frustration is we broadly had that 4, 5, 6 years ago because of 1.5 degrees, the FLG reports, you know, and actually, broadly speaking, I think generally we had an industry behind us, you know, in a broad spectrum of the industry, and it's there's been a big hole knocked in that recently.
Tim.
Coming on. Good morning, panel. That's been a fascinating 45 minutes. I guess I've got hundreds of questions now running through my head like crazy, and I think it's startling that, you know, as we progress the agricultural route map, we are 2 years out from some significant changes, and everybody around this table is sitting there going, no, ARIOB is not delivered. I think my initial concern with ARIOB was always, you know, were the people actually on it being listened to? Because my understanding would be, I mean, just like Johnny and Kate here, we've got hundreds of years of experience on that panel, but yet it's not being taken through. But what's come up probably more than anything this morning is the computer system. The IT system's just not able to deliver. So, I mean, Jim Walker said there, you wrote a report. That report was a good report. All of that could have been implemented and take the industry on a 10-year journey. So I guess my question then is, just how worried should I be that we don't have the infrastructure in place in the background to actually deliver all of this stuff that we're talking about, whether it be the top priorities in the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill, whether we talk about what's coming forward in the Rural Support Plan, etc. You know, should it be something that we really need to be speaking about at the highest level?
I absolutely think we should be talking about this at the highest level. I mean, we've already alluded to it a few times already this morning, in the sense that the biggest single constraint on policy development and therefore its implementation and getting on with it and then playing catch-up, and playing catch-up you always end up losing usually, is the ability to deliver. And that's a fundamental issue around the IT system and everything that goes with that. I go back to 2013-14 and Nigel Miller, who's been referenced already. I remember sitting in a conversation with Nigel Miller, who was president of NFU Scotland at the time, and Richard Lockhead, who was the cabinet secretary at the time, and a guy called Drew Sloan, who was the chief agricultural officer at the time. Yeah. Basically, Nigel said, the last thing we should be doing around this CAP reform is building policy that works for an IT system. It has to be the other way around. And I've got a real fear right now, and I said it at an ARIOB meeting 2 weeks ago, that we're in danger of doing that again. We will build policy around an IT system rather than determining what the policy and what we want to try and deliver is, and then work out how best to deliver it. And I think that's a real and significant risk to success here, in that, say, we could come up with the best policy in the world, but unless we can deliver it, and unless we also have the right funding in behind it, which is another story altogether, then we're not going to go anywhere.
Because, and just to touch on that, I mean, the Minister was in this room on the 19th of February talking about this very subject. He was asked directly, Jim Fairley, about the money and support that was in place. He said to us, I am confident that the people who are doing the work that we require them to do will deliver it for us. And when I asked the head of the IT department what funding was in place, she was unaware if there was any. So for me, then, I am right in thinking there is a significant concern there. And I know it's not all about the IT system, but fundamentally that is the delivery mechanism through which we get support out.
Well, I absolutely. And I go back to what I said earlier. Essentially, you know, from 18 months ago, probably not even 18 months, a year ago, thinking we would have a drop-down menu for Tier 2 options, the sort of thing that Kate described, where every individual farmer and crofter could pick and choose different options that suited them to deliver outcomes that worked for their business first and foremost, but then also delivered on the environment and biodiversity issues that we want to tackle. We've gone from that to basically rolling over ecological focus areas under current greening measures, with a few tweaks at the margins, if that. And that isn't going to cut it when we're trying to deliver on all these different outcomes. We need something that allows us to move forward. But as I say, the constraining factor isn't the lack of ambition around policy, it's the lack of a capability to implement that.
So it might be worth the committee asking the Minister or somebody, whether it's directly or through FOI, how much money was spent originally putting that IT system in place.
I think we have had. I mean, it was several hundred million.
It was certainly over 200 million, and how much, more importantly, is spent annually keeping it cobbled together with a couple of hundred programmers working on it, trying to keep it alive, and how much, in view of whatever policies they finally decide to pursue, it would cost to replace it. Because my guess is it's budgetary constraints that are holding this back, because they couldn't afford to make the commitment again that they did the last time. And remember, the previous minister referred to by Johnny, Richard Lockhead, lost his job in the back of this because farmers didn't get paid in time. So that's quite a big concern politically for whoever's in power.
We're nearly an hour into the session, and we need to get into the meat of some of this, excuse the pun. But just before we move on, Pete, I know you were involved in writing the report. Have you got any comments on Tim's question before we move on in relation to the IT system?
The report, I'm not sure which report you're referring to, Finlay.
I think you made comment in the past about the IT system and the ability to deliver on the advance payments.
You know, as everybody said, you know, we designed a very expensive duck-billed platypus that could only do one job and live in one environment. And we need something that's much more generic and flexible to deliver, you know, support to farmers. But we started from a point of saying we're going to keep the area-based payment system and all the bells and whistles and frills that go with that make for a very complicated system in the first place. It costs a huge amount to administer these payment systems. Can't remember, you know, it's 10 or 15% of the payments go on delivery. I mean, that's compared to other sectors, that's extraordinarily high in terms of getting money out the door. And you know, there was great stuff in the farmer-led groups, really good stuff coming from, here's how we could fix these problems. But you know, you could spend money in very different ways. You could say to the beef sector, get together, we'll give you some money over the next 10 years based on delivering these goals. If you don't deliver these goals, you won't get the money. Get yourselves together, sort it out, deliver them. You could spend the £650 million in lots of different ways. But we locked ourselves in to keeping on spending it, mostly the same way we've always spent it. So we need an IT system. And then every time we try and tweak that, the IT system says no. So it's been a real failure of policy implementation.
Okay. Sorry, Tim, I'm happy to intervene here. I'm going to move on to a question from Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. We've started to touch on what I'm going to ask about, and that's around the agricultural transition in Scotland and how that's being communicated. And Jim, you said earlier, or just a moment ago, that farmers are feeling disconnected from the government. But Kate, if I could start with you, what feedback have you been receiving from farmers regarding the agricultural transition in Scotland, how it's being communicated, and the potential, the kind of discussions they're having about its potential impact on their day-to-day lives?
I think the general feeling would be that it hasn't been communicated, and I do know that government have tried, but they're not speaking the same language as the farmers, basically. So farmers out there, they've, I think, from my point of view, I think they've absorbed the message that change is coming, which is scary. But what's even more scary is they don't even really know what that change is. And at a very practical level, as a farmer, what you want out there is you want somebody to tell you what you should be doing, and then you want to be able to choose what works best for your farm. So it needs to be much more than just a sort of high-level overview of you need to reduce your emissions. You need to have practical options as to what you can do so that you can then work out, one, if you can do them, achieve them on your farm, two, whether it's going to be practical to do it and whether you're going to still make a profit if you do it. You know, so you need to have those actual on-the-ground options, and I think that's what's missing. That's what the measures, going back to that, were meant to, in my understanding, were meant to convey, but because we've not been able to go anywhere with them, people really just don't know what they're being asked to do, but they do know that they're going to be asked to do something, and that's scary.
It's completely counterintuitive, Aaron, because in any other business I've ever been involved in, you set the strategy for the business based on the outcomes you want to achieve. And then once you've got the strategy, you put the actions in place to achieve that. Then you put measurables in place to see whether it's every month, every week, every year. You measure against a start point. What we proposed was collecting data for a start point and then measuring on an annual, biannual, every 5 years, whatever it needed to be, and a transition period for 10 years to allow people at different stages of their development, whether they were nervous about the future, whether it was a small farm, a big farm, a really efficient farm, or not very efficient farm, to be able to access various tools to help and enable them to get to that outcome and get rewarded for it. So not just bang on additional conditionality to receive outdated subsidy through outdated subsidy mechanisms, but get rewarded for doing things differently and being able to prove, more importantly, that you're doing that. So, for example, in the beef sector, just a small practical example. We run trials in a shed that's been going now since this group was set up by us in 2021. So we're in our 5th cycle now. 3 times a year, 80 animals in the shed. Every single animal, we know exactly what it eats and exactly what it drinks in real time every day. And they're lying in sawdust, so they can't eat any straw or anything on the floor. So we know every single thing about that animal. What have we discovered? We have discovered that we know exactly how many kilos of food each of those animals eats to put on a kilo of meat. And the best performers would eat 2.5 to 3 kilos of food to put on a kilo of weight gain. The worst performers, which are still highly efficient animals and look good, are taking 15 kilos. Beside this measurable, we've got methane monitoring equipment, and we're correlating with a university based in Scotland the output of methane from the animals to say that we can then show and prove that the best performing animals produce X methane and the worst performing animals produce X plus. We are now taking real live decisions, and have been for 3 years, about what bulls we keep, about what animals we keep for breeding, and we're seeing a significant increase in the efficiency of the herd, and at the same time can prove that methane from those animals is being reduced. So these are the real things that can happen in real farms if the signals and the outcomes are given by government and farmers just get on with it and do it themselves. In Canada this year, they will be selling semen for artificially inseminating cattle, which has methane data with it that they claim can reduce methane emissions by up to 25%. I don't believe it for a second. It's probably neither 10 or 12, but 10 or 12 is better than nothing. But what it shows is around the world people are doing real things at a practical level, and our government and our policy in Scotland is so far behind the 8 ball, we're doing nothing. So it's left to individual farmers to do it themselves, or they get out. And that's the two choices that's happening at the minute. And that is happening in front of our eyes. The herd is shrinking because people that can't jump in that bandwagon or can't afford to invest in that kind of equipment leave. The good ones are getting stuck in and doing really good things with it. Okay. And we'll get there despite despite the lack of government policy, not because of it.
Okay, so that's really helpful in terms of the kind of practical options that Kate's talking about. I just want to come back to, and I hope, Johnny, you've got your hand up. I want to hear, like, how... So, Kate, you said that it's not been communicated by the government. This agricultural transition in Scotland hasn't been communicated. And, Johnny, did your members feel it's been communicated? And what are they discussing in terms of the potential impact on their day-to-day operations?
Exactly the point I wanted to come back to, the communication side. We talk about communications. What does this transition, what does this change process look like? What does it feel like? What does it mean for individual farms, crofts? On that aspect of it, you know, almost setting aside the policy development and the implementation piece, the communication piece has been absolutely woeful, completely lacking. We really need, I mean, terminology like agricultural reform programme, agricultural route map, that sort of thing doesn't mean things to farmers, doesn't mean much at all to farmers and crofters. They want to drill down into the detail of the who, what, when, where and how stuff. What's going to happen, when, how does it affect me, what does it mean, how do I embrace this change if I have to embrace it, and so on. And I'll give you an example of that. You know, as an organisation, we are kind of up to here with having to do a lot of Scottish Government's communication on its behalf. Last November and December, from Shetland down to Castle Douglas, over a 3-week period, talked to about the best part of 1,000 of our members across those meetings, 10 meetings, and basically had to set out exactly what was happening in 2025, 2026, and so on in terms of what they would have to do. Things like the whole farm plan now being a requirement under the BPS system before we even get to Tier 1 for 2025, and about having to do 2 of 5 audits or whatever it might be. That was absolute news to the majority of our members. Despite you can write stuff in magazines and you can post stuff to them, but actually when you stand up in front of a room full of farmers and you explain this is what you're going to have to do, guys, then the penny drops all of a sudden. And that puts people on the defensive straight away. You then talk through the processes around what help they can get to do that, whether they're already doing those sorts of things or not, and a lot of people are already doing those sorts of things. But it's simple things like that about, you know, we've always used this expression, and I think Jim used it very much earlier on, about you need to take the industry with you. Taking the industry with you relies on communication from day one about change and about how change is going to impact on them and how they can adapt and adjust to change and not be afraid of change. Because change creates, the thought of change creates uncertainty. But if you understand change, you actually want to embrace it and move on with it.
Can I just come back with Johnny?
Neil, you wanted to comment some time ago, and then Jim.
Yeah, sorry. So thank you. I do want to give sort of the communication teams in government some credit in that I think they have been listening. They've actually had very little to communicate. And then I think the panel have been right when they then have tried to communicate it. It's just been a bit of a jumble. We've encouraged them to get out and talk to farmers. And to be fair, over the last year, they did attend a number of auction markets round about the country through, you know, probably local, regional offices going to markets. And it was more to say, you might not have anything to say, but just go out there and speak to, you know, the farmers and then listen to what you're getting back. You know, it's two-way, isn't it? It's not just all, you know, a lot of stuff comes out of government. And I think, as everybody said, you know, terminology that means very little, you know, actually, what do I need to do on my farm? So, to be fair, government did that. They got out. I don't know how much feedback they got from that. I don't know whether it was successful. But I would damn well encourage them to do more of that. There are plenty of places they can go every week in this country to talk to farmers, and they should be doing a lot more of that.
Yeah, just briefly. So what is a just transition? What does it mean? What does it mean to an ordinary guy just trying to, an ordinary person trying to make a living on a farm? What does it mean? Because you see it in the news, you hear about a just transition for Grangemouth, and what that means is they're closing the refinery. So what does it actually mean to people that have to be part of this journey? The second part, Ariane, just so from a practical perspective, the most interaction that a farmer or a livestock farmer certainly would have with anybody from government is when they come and count your sheep. Bizarrely, 15 years after headage payments were part of Scottish agricultural policy and a payment mechanism, they still come, armies of them, counting sheep every day in the year around the country, and we, in this room, all pay for it. We have absolutely no idea why they count sheep, but they come and count sheep. And if you don't have the right number of sheep, they're not happy, and they start threatening to fine you, etc., etc. So it's utterly bizarre that we're still creating jobs for the boys and girls, but part of that isn't actually engaging with the community that serve them.
Supplementary, Emma Harper, then we're going to have to move on.
Okay, so I'm sitting here listening to this about co-production, co-design, co-delivery, co-involvement. It's really similar to what experience I have when we were looking at the National Care Service, co-design when it comes to lived experience and engaging folk. And, you know, as a former nurse educator, it was about how do you get to the nurses on the ground so that they know what's coming down the line. And Johnny's saying that the farmers are like, just tell me what you want me to do. So, but that's not co-design, or it's about engagement. So it's really complicated and difficult, and I'm thinking about how we deliver healthcare change. They talk about moving a giant oil tanker, and that's healthcare embedded in Scotland in our NHS. So I'm thinking about like that as far as what Pete was saying way back at the beginning about education should be the priority on the wedding cake. So it should be the first thing that we deal with. So I'm thinking about that. It's like, is this... Yeah, so, okay. Yeah, but it's complicated, though. It's really challenging to look at how do we effect change, get all the voices heard. And so how do we...
Reason, back to the very start of this meeting and the first question about farmer-led groups, the whole point of the farmer-led groups was to engage with the industry at a grassroots level, not at a representative level where it's people representing whoever it happens to be, but at a grassroots level to understand what people who had a skin in the game actually could see the future looking like. Then engage with civil servants and others, environmental lobbyists. We were right in the same room as the NGOs, environmental NGOs as well, because we know it's a journey we've got to go on together, and a shared journey. And the supply trade was in the room from day one, upstream and downstream. So it's not complicated. What's complicated is when you get the answers, they don't want to do anything with it. That's the problem. And the reason they don't want to do anything with it, in my opinion, is twofold. One, politically, it's too difficult. But secondly, because we gave the civil service and officials the answers that they were completely incapable or unable to come up with, they didn't like it. And now they're kicking back and going back to the good old days where let's have a committee meeting every day of the week and completely ignore the people in the committee. And if you squeeze the ones in the committee hard enough and love them enough and make them feel good enough about life, then you can ignore them after the meeting. And that's what's happened.
I agree with a lot of what you said today, but you're wrong about that. It's very complicated. And it's complicated because it's a massive organisational change programme involving 20,000 very small businesses for the most part.
That's why you show them the ways they can improve their businesses and they'll follow on.
Well,
peer pressure and peers showing people how to do it is the way to get farmers to engage, not telling them what to do.
Okay.
Knowledge exchange is really important, peer pressure, but that's all about culture and values. It's about what makes a good farmer. It's about why we think it's important to keep small farmers, you know, in remote and rural areas. It's about, are we praising efficiency on its own? Are we praising animal welfare? How important is climate change to people? How important is nature to people? These are all about values. And we're working with a very complicated organisational change programme. And what we haven't done is invest in exactly the sorts of things Jim's talking about, people talking to each other in a structured, organised way, and we haven't invested in departmental reform within the agriculture department. So we're putting new wine into old wine into new bottles. You know, which way around is it? New wine into old bottles. That's the way around. We've got people in the agriculture department who aren't sure what the change is either. They're not sure what they're trying to sell. So we've got a lack of clarity, you've got organisational chaos, because we're not managing it as a complex change programme. We're trying to manage it through giving farmers carrots and sticks, right? That's not how you manage complicated change.
Very briefly, I'm very aware we're way behind schedule, so I'm trying to keep questions and responses as short as possible. So briefly, Neil, before we move on.
I would say historically, broadly, agriculture has been a policy follower. So if you can get the policy right, however that looks and however complicated it is, then you can generally get the industry to follow you. I sense we're missing some of that opportunity, and the market's taken over. And Pete talked about that much earlier. You know, if this policy doesn't come forward just shortly, the market's moving, not just in the beef sector, but in plenty of other sectors, and the market will take over.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to our second set of questions, which is about outcomes. Tim Eagle.
Don't laugh at this. So let's move to a positive for a second, right? Because I do genuinely believe we have great farmers in Scotland. We produce great food, really high quality food. Europe wants our food, and we should be able to supply that. But the Climate Change Plan update in 2020 said by 2032, the agricultural sector in Scotland will have adopted and be completely using all available low emissions technologies. I don't think we're really there yet, are we? But that's 7 harvests. That's not a long way away, is it, in reality? So I guess my question is, what progress has the agricultural sector of Scotland made towards meeting our climate change targets?
I think that's questions.
Of technology has gathered pace in the last 20 years beyond anything I've seen in my entire lifetime, because efficiencies on farm have driven that. Yeah. You have to be efficient to make any kind of margin at all. And if you're not efficient, you don't. The good news for policymakers and the good news for the climate is that the more efficiently you do something, the less emissions there's likely to be in the process of doing it, whether that's production of livestock, whether that's arable, whether that's using less fertiliser. So by default, because farmers are being forced and wanting to be as efficient and as modernised as they can be, we're doing things now in the farm that I wouldn't have expected 10 years ago would have been seen in a livestock farm. You know, GPS going round fields, very spreading fertiliser, very spreading slurry, very spreading dung, etc., is something that the arable sector did 10, 20 years ago, using different tyre technology to avoid soil compaction. There's loads of really clever on-farm practical things that are happening that have taken the industry miles forward in the last 20 years, and the industry should be very proud of it. In answer to Pete's question about smaller farmers and in remote areas, Rhoda, in the Highlands and Islands, I think it's time that somebody in government grasps the fact that there are 2 things going on in agriculture in Scotland. One is really efficient farmers, big or small, doing their thing. The other is people who don't have the ability to do that because they're not in that kind of environment, i.e. area. And if you want to keep people farming or crofting in those areas, carve them out, set up a budget and do bespoke policies for them, whether it's LFA support, call it what you like, so that these people have a chance to live the kind of life they want to live in the very difficult and remote areas they're in. And if it's partly a social policy, then so be it. Explain to them what it is you're doing for them, and then there'll be people who want to live there and they're looked after properly, because the one-size-fits-all policies we're working with at the moment sure as hell don't add up for farmers in East Lothian or the southwest of Scotland versus those in the Highlands and Islands. It just doesn't work.
Thank you. Johnny, and then, or Pete, can you come in, and then Johnny?
So there's obviously a lag, Tim, between what we record and the inventory has problems in capturing on-farm practice. So the inventory won't be capturing the good stuff Jim's doing at the moment, and it'll be a lag. But you know, as I said earlier, 4% reduction in emissions intensity in 30 years in the beef sector, that's the actual figure. So there have been improvements in lots of technology, but we saw, for example, an increase in carbon emissions from arable farms because they're driving the tractors more and the tractors are bigger. That might change as we move towards min-till, but we haven't picked up those numbers yet. So it's quite hard to get a very good, you know, blow-by-blow update. But certainly we're not getting the uptake of low emissions technologies across the board. If you look at slurry spreading, for example, half of it is still broadcast and not ploughed in. So, you know, at just the most basic level, what we do with the manure from our cattle, you know, we're not getting that uptake on low emissions technology we should have.
Okay.
Quickly, I'm going to endorse everything Jim's just said around innovation driving efficiency, which is very, very clear, and the connection between efficiency and driving down emissions. But I think we need to be clear that it's not about trying to get agriculture to zero emissions. It's about moving towards net zero. And there is a subtle but huge difference between the two. Yes, we can reduce our emissions, but we're talking about agricultural biological processes here. We're always going to have emissions. So it's the other things around how do we sequester more carbon into our soils, peatlands, farm woodlands and all the rest of it, as well as driving efficiencies, and how do we do the adaptation piece as well. And that is key. That is absolutely key to how we drive future policy. And the other thing around that, again, Jim touched on it, is if you look at the Agriculture and Rural Communities Act, those 4 things around food production, climate, biodiversity and people, every farm in Croft has a contribution to make to each and every one of those, but in different ways. So one size fits all ain't going to work. We've got to reflect on the fact that actually extensive grazing systems in our hills and uplands are actually really good for biodiversity and fantastic for social cohesion and all the rest of it. The socio-economic elements to this are critical. And that's a key aspect of suckler beef production. It's not just about the kilos of beef and how much it's worth to the Scottish economy. And you can apply that to any sector. So let's focus on enabling farms and crofts of all sorts of different sizes and types to focus on what they do best, and also make sure that they do their bit on the bits that they are second best at. But there's not, I will paraphrase Marie Goujon and say there is no contradiction between food, climate and biodiversity. Get it right with policy and we can deliver all those outcomes.
Neil.
I think Jim touched on small farms here. I would just broadly say that there is a potential that the gap grows and that, smaller farms, crofts, potentially get left behind in this because of some of the costs of moving into some of those technologically advanced areas and then getting the broader efficiencies across a larger scale. But the bottom line is we will only find businesses continuing to take this on if we have profitable sectors. Policy plays a part of that, but I'll go back to my point earlier. We've moved in some sectors to a point where the potential isn't enough production. So actually, we might start to see those businesses moving into a more profitable area where they can invest more, and then you accelerate that. If we just don't have the underlying economics working properly, then people are going to struggle to invest.
Okay, thank you. My question has more or less been answered, so I'm going to move on to the next question from Emma Harper.
Thanks. I'll be really quick because I am conscious of time. Jim, you talked about innovation and different things that can be done to support emissions reduction, and I know about giving dairy cattle Bovaer, for instance, to reduce their methane. What other innovative examples can you just briefly touch on to tell us about that can help reduce emissions and help support efficiency, if there's anything that you haven't mentioned so far?
It's not just that particular product. In this trial shed that I've talked about, we've been renting out our animals to feed companies to trial emission or methane inhibitors to see what difference it made. From 2 perspectives. One is to see how much methane it really did reduce, and secondly, what impact did that have on the efficiency of the animal and its ability to put on weight. So there's some quite interesting information coming out about that. As ever, there's lots of good snake oil salesmen out there, Emma, but not many of them are selling real oil, they're selling snake oil. I could sit here all day and talk about the innovation in terms of better use of nitrogen fertiliser, better use of slurry, better use of better looking after the soil better, which is obviously key to everybody. Having a profitable farm. The whole of our farm, we've mapped 700 hectares of our farm with coring down to a metre, looking at soil carbon as well as the normal stuff that you would do. So there's loads of things out there that you can do to make it more efficient. But you've got to have a plan, and you've got to have a plan in your own mind and on a piece of paper for your own business. What is the outcome you want at the end of that 5-year period? We're working on a 5-year timescale. The thing I think we've got to be really careful of in all of this, though, is that we're all getting excited about the climate emergency, apart from emergency measures to tackle it. And 50% of the world's methane is produced by 5 countries: China, India, the US, Russia and Brazil. and one of them only, Brazil, is part of the global pledge on methane reduction. And interestingly, in the news driving up here this morning for COP30, there's a big hoo-ha today because Brazil is cutting down hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of acres of rainforest to make a road in to the conference centre for COP30. So there's a lot of nonsense being talked about what actually the impact. What we could do in this country by forcing people to targets that are completely unachievable because they were set politically, and I noticed last night in the news as well that the government have abandoned their idea for ground source heat pumps in every house after a year or two of buying one. So there's some practical chickens coming home to roost there now. Be careful that you don't drive, I'm talking for the beef and the sheep sector here, which is what I know, drive them out of the industry in Scotland and then you end up having to import them, if you can find them, number one, for more money, and secondly, from areas or parts of the world that clearly have higher emissions output, and the meat is from a higher emissions area. That could easily happen for two reasons. One, because we're in a policy vacuum, or two, because the policy vacuum in agriculture is coupled with a drive to net zero that bears no relation to the reality on the ground.
Yeah, I just want to labour Johnny's point that net zero is not zero emissions, and there is so much carbon removal work that can be done on farms in Scotland, and at the moment it's not being counted. So all the good work that Jim says he's doing on his farm, brilliant for him, brilliant for efficiency, it's not being counted. Nobody's counting this stuff because we don't have the accuracy of measurements down there. So we're still calling, even at this point in time, a cow, a cow, a cow. You know, you don't measure all cars the same. You know, electric cars give out less emissions than diesel cars. Cows are all the same because at the moment we're using national averages, we're not using, or even international averages in some cases, we're not using actual figures. So QMS and HDB are running a baselining project over 170 farms across the UK, which is exactly what Jim's doing on his own farm at his own cost. You're a bit ahead of us because you've been doing it a bit longer, to show exactly what carbon is stored below the soil and in the above ground vegetation, because farmers aren't going to respond to just being hit with a stick all the time about emissions. They need to see what they can do and what they can achieve and what differences they can make, and work in other countries. For example, Northern Ireland has shown that there are very simple, we maybe call them innovative, they're not really, it's different grass swards, it's different grazing patterns, it's things that people were doing 10 decades, hundreds of years ago, really, that we're kind of going back to. And that shows how much difference can be made on specific farms in their net carbon position, which is what we need to get to, and how things like an animal health outbreak can impact so greatly on that. And that, if you can see that as a farmer and you can see the figures, that really brings home to you how important things like animal health are when you're talking about not just your own efficiency and your own profitability, but emissions as well, and tie them all together.
Thank you. Pete.
I just say, I agree with Kate. Adopting innovations in agriculture, it's not the innovations, it's getting them adopted. And we've known for 80 years that that follows the S-shaped curve. You know, and you have pioneers like Jim, they do things, it takes a long time for that to move up the curve and for most farmers to do it. You know, injecting slurry, you know, even look at estimated breeding values, intercropping, there's lots of things, even using clover in swards. I mean, there's things that people have been doing for millennia that still aren't adopted. So we need to, government doesn't have an innovation strategy. And if you look at CATIF, Knowledge Transfer and Innovation Fund, that is 0.1% of the agriculture budget, 0.1%. 1/1000th of the money we're giving to farmers, we're using to support innovation. Now, a lot of innovation is done by farmers themselves, a lot is done by private companies, but for a government trying to do a change programme to spend 1/1000th of its money on innovation and knowledge transfer, that undercuts the potential for change. Knowledge transfer is about people talking to each other and saying, I've done this, what do you think? Right? It's fundamental to the change, as Jim said. So we need to boost innovation spending, skills training, advice. We've got ideas about a skills pipeline for the next generation of farmers. There's lots of potential, but you have to invest in the change. And tweaking the subsidies doesn't make the change happen. And we've known from government figures for years that actually the current payment system stops change rather than encourages change.
Okay. Briefly, Johnny.
Yeah, just to add to Pete's last point there, investment in change, that's a critical phrase. You know, it's the role of government in many ways to provide the seed corn to move from that knowledge transfer bit up to something scalable that many, many farms and crops can buy into. And I think a pertinent example in Scotland right now is there's been some talk about the decarbonisation of agricultural machinery, but have we actually really moved on that in terms of investment in it? Not yet. So that's the whole concept of almost a circular economy on farms, generating through renewables into hydrogen, into machinery that you're therefore not using diesel, and also the possibility of creating green manures and all the rest of it. Sorry, I'm not going to go into any detail on that, but that decarbonisation piece, you know, one thing that did come out of the Committee on Climate Change report a fortnight ago, and not just about changing diets and reducing livestock numbers, but they're starting to at least recognise that there's other tools in the toolbox as well that we'll have to deploy. And that was absolutely one of them. There's an opportunity there for Scottish Government to really initiate things on a proper scale to make that happen.
Thank you.
Example to that. So from my own personal experience, between 2 carbon audits that we did on the farm, our carbon figure went down drastically. And when we drilled into it, the difference had been that the second time we did it had been a drier year. The grass hadn't grown as much. We'd made less silage, so therefore we used less fuel in our vehicles and less plastic to wrap our bales. And neither of those things are things that I, as a farmer on the ground, can do anything about. So we need that bigger piece as well.
Very briefly, Jim.
So without harping on, I sent two attachments yesterday, hopefully, to the committee. And the second one was a map from the European Space Agency of methane emissions around the world and what appears in what part, or what is in what part of the world and where the most intense output comes from. And you'll note there is absolutely nothing come out of the UK. That's how insignificant we are. In New Zealand, there's 10 million cows and they're renowned for sheep. There's less than 500,000 in Scotland. There's 26 million sheep. And just for clarity, Emma, you like the black and white cows because of where you're from. They produce 98 kilos of methane a year. The black cows we're talking about here, the beef cows, produce 60. So just to get it into perspective, there's a lot of generalisations talked about the impact of emissions from Scotland and Scotland's cattle herd and sheep flock. But to get it into perspective, we are a pinprick in the world. Not to say we don't need to do anything, we most certainly do, but it has to be done hand in hand with efficient production on farms, because without people to manage the land, you can have all the aspirations for reducing emissions you like, and it ain't going to happen.
Okay. I would like to continue this session for maybe another 20-25 minutes. Is there anybody needing to rush away? Good. So on that basis, I'm going to extend the session, but I'm going to take a 5-minute recess for a comfort break. Let's suspend this meeting. Okay, we're now going to resume. We'll probably got through until 11 o'clock for the remainder of the questions. And I move to Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel, and thanks for all your answers so far. My question is around the main challenges that farmers face when transitioning to more sustainable practices. Now, I know this is an issue from the farmers that I speak to in my own area. What, in your view, are the challenges? Now, I had heard from some of your comments so far. Kate, you said, what has changed? What are practical options that farmers can look at? Johnny, you said there were issues with communication, how information is imparted to farmers. Someone said that farmers want to be told, so do we need to be more prescriptive? Kate, can I come to you first?
I think I said farmers need to be told, but I didn't mean in a prescriptive way. I just meant in a clear way the actual actions that they can take, so they know exactly. So, you know, plant multi-species swards or incorporate legumes wherever you can. That sort of specific piece. Knowledge is obviously a gap there. There's also the financial implications. So no farmer is going to do something which is going to cost them money and not make them any money. Why would anybody do that? There's also the sort of social side of it as well. And farmers are very good at doing what others in their area are doing. They, you know, we all like nothing better than to look over farm gates what other people are doing. So there is the acceptance as well. If you're doing something different, you've maybe got to be quite a brave person to do something a bit different in the first instance, and then it gathers pace as more people in the area would do it. So that's three things that I think are probably challenges to a lot of farmers. And again, the profile, I know not all farmers are old, but the profile is quite towards the more mature end of the spectrum in at least the decision makers. And as we all know, as you get older, it becomes more difficult to change. Younger people are really good at it. So it's another sort of tick in the box for trying to get as many young people into the sector as possible, because they are the ones that are more likely to embrace that change and go for it.
I think my take on it, Evelyn, is a bit, I don't disagree with what Kate says. It's fairly straightforward. It's about cost. If you get involved in an environmental scheme, for example, almost certainly, even if there's a support payment attached to it, you'll be asked to contribute something to some kind of capital project, capital investment to do it, whether it's fencing, whether it's putting trees in, whether it's digging a pond, doesn't matter what it is. Similarly, if you invest in improved technology on the farm, it's going to cost you money. You've got to be able to see that there's a return on that money, as Kate rightly said, but if you don't have the cash in the first place because your business is just bobbling along the bottom, then you're never going to do it. So you've got to find ways of getting people up that ladder, which is back to this piece of paper from 5 years ago, which was to engage with people at different stages on that ladder of how invested they are in their businesses and how likely they are to employ technology, efficient farming methods or whatever. And part of that was carrot and part of that was stick. It was mentioned earlier on about the carrot. I don't see much carrot at the moment. It's all stick, so additional conditionality attached to existing schemes. The schemes are not properly funded because inflation's eroded them away, as I gave an example earlier on about LFA from the last 20 years. So that becomes a lifeline payment as opposed to something that you can put away in a cupboard and then think about how you might invest it later to improve the profitability of your farm. So that's the big issue. So even these capital grants that were talked about by the First Minister at the NFU conference, or reportedly, capital grants coming out again this year. I called the last one the Father Christmas scheme because it encouraged people to go and buy new toys and they had to pay 50% of them and most of them couldn't afford them. New slurry tankers, new other pieces of equipment without any idea why they were doing it. They did it because there was a grant there, so they thought it must be a good idea. And that's the problem with this hodgepodge lack of policy and lack of defined outcomes that we've got at the moment.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I agree with what Kate and others said. So I think part of it is cost, but it's also time. I used to run a small herd of 20 suckler cows, right? And we didn't, until my son came back, he said, why aren't we PDing? Why aren't we pregnancy diagnosing? All these cattle. You don't know whether they're pregnant or not, Dad. You're wasting money. And I go, oh, yeah, all right then. And we get around to it. We had to buy a bull because, rightly, neighbours went out of lending bulls because of health concerns. So we had to buy a bull for 20 cows. What a waste of money. Total waste of money. If you've got 300 cows, maybe it's a good idea, but it's a waste of money for us. But there wasn't an AI service that could say, OK, we'll help you AI your cows and we'll give you a good bull that's easy calving for your sort of system. And I think providing some of these infrastructure supports to smaller farmers is really, really important so that they can get a bit more efficient because they don't have the economies of scale. Silage testing, lots of things where we didn't have the information to do better. And for us to invest in getting that information on a small scale, felt like it cost quite a lot to do. So it's that, provide that infrastructure support. But just finally on Kate, I'd say that the social bit is really important here. So the question always is, do farmers like me do these sorts of things, right? What do farmers like me do? So the social acceptance of taking some of these things on board, like mob grazing, like putting clover in your sward, like there's lots how you manage your slurry. There's lots of things where you copy what your neighbours do and have always done. And until your neighbours change, it's very hard for you to change because you're seen as, well, you're doing a bit weird. So,
can I just ask a follow-up here? And it was in regard to what Johnny said and what Neil said earlier about sort of communication and the sort of educational piece. Because is there something about the government having to go out and speak to people face to face? And that was a point you made, Neil. I'm very interested. Do we need to speak more face to face with farmers?
So I think there's a couple of things in that, aren't we? So for years and years and years, we've asked farmers to do a particular thing driven by CAP. And suddenly, almost virtually at the drop of a hat, we've gone, oh, hold on. We have to now suddenly change over here. So there is a massive change piece going on there that revolves on everything that we've talked about here: education, social elements, established practice, all of those kind of things. But I think it's been talked about earlier. Farmers learning from farmers and working together on things and working their way through. But Jim and Kate hit the nail on the head. This is all about investment. Do I have the confidence to invest? Will I see a return in that? Because generally speaking, I will probably have to go to a bank, and this is putting my old hat on. How do I justify to the bank that I can make this happen? Especially when, as Jim says, I've had a business that's probably been bobbing along and maybe giving me a bit of a hand-to-mouth living, but we're not a lot of surplus that I could show to the bank. Well, I'm going to be able to repay this loan. Because at the moment, I don't have a long timeline for policy or for support payment income. Yes, the market's improved, but geopolitically, we're potential volatility coming along. There's a lot of challenges out there. And I suspect at the moment, more farmers are maybe looking to batten down the hatches than actually and take some of this good time that's here just now, rather than necessarily go and take another risk, because it's a bit opaque what the future looks like. But to your point, I think the best communication is to actually speak face to face with as many farmers as you can. And I would always encourage anybody in this room, officials, whoever it is in the industry. It's, in my mind, it's always the best policy, because it still is a very person-to-person industry.
Yeah, that's me, convener.
A very succinct supplementary from Ariane.
Thanks, Convener. I just want to pick up on the piece around what policy supports or mechanisms would be most effective for helping farmers. And so, Kate, you were talking earlier about lack of certainty, lack of young people coming into the sector. And Pete, right at the beginning, you talked about Tier 4 being a priority. So there's something in there around that education space. I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that kind of education that we need to transition, but also to get more people in, because I think that we're having a conversation about a sector that also is losing people. So maybe if I could start with Pete and then come to you, Kate.
Yeah, so first of all, just pick up on what Neil was saying. This knowledge exchange between farmers is really important. We've run a few projects with Soil Association and others over the last few years, just getting farmers who are a little bit further, a little bit more committed to make some of these changes, talking to farmers who are not, and facilitating those conversations so that people feel safe to ask questions and to have those conversations. 300 farmers, half men, half women. Really important point here that often the women are the people who actually support the change in the farms, and they're often overlooked, but they're often the change makers behind the scenes to get things to move along. But more generally, we're in a change programme, and in any other change programme in Scotland, whether it's renewables or whether it's construction, you know, we've got a whole training apparatus and an innovation apparatus and a skills apparatus to drive that change. The Construction Industry Training Board brings people together and says, what skills do we need for the future? Where are we going to get our people? They take that systemic approach. Agriculture is about 20% of our emissions, but it's not getting 20% of that sort of investment in the skills pipeline, in innovation, in knowledge transfer. It's just not getting that sort of investment that it needs. And we have been working with Joe Hunt, as you know, and others on a skills pipeline proposal. And I think there's something in that about really trying to move forward on the industry for the 21st century.
Yeah, we've got Kate and then Johnny.
So QMS run the Monitor Farm programme has already been mentioned, and I was a monitor farmer way back about 13 years ago. My husband and I were monitor farmers for 3 years, and we really were part of that peer-to-peer knowledge exchange, which was so valuable for our business, for other people's business roundabout. I'll give one tiny example of that. We were encouraged at that point to make better quality silage to save money. We did that. The others in the group saw that we were doing it. We then got a prize in a national competition. All the rest of the group saw that. They all went, well, if you can do it, maybe we can do it. So then they started doing the same thing. It's not difficult. You just cut grass at a different time. It's not rocket science. But then, even after we were finished the programme, 3 or 4 years later, our SAC consultant said to me, the average silage quality in the whole of Peeblesshire has gone up since you were monitor farmers. So that shows how that sort of thing feeds out over everybody who was interested. 2 things from my veterinary life. I think the model that SRUC have pursued with the new vet school is to basically look, going back to education, is to look at the problem we've got in Scotland, which is we don't have enough large animal vets. And then they've gone and, as far as I can see, I'm not involved in it, but as far as I can see, it designed a new vet school which then tackles that problem. So they're actually specifically targeting students from rural areas who are likely to stay in rural areas and stay in large animal practice. So it kind of solves the problem. And the other thing from my vet life is, as a vet, you have to do continuing professional development. We don't have that in the farming sector. Is it something that we should be looking at? And it doesn't have to be formal learning. It can be going to monitor farms. It can be going along to evening meetings. But it should definitely be something that we are encouraging.
Yeah, I think Ariane's question actually augments Evelyn's question earlier on about how do we underpin the transition here. And one of the fundamental things around this, in my opinion, is that we need to recognise and reward what is good practice and best practice. And that really should be the ambition around how do we target future support. And at the moment, we have a huge opportunity. And if you think about, you know, I've mentioned already decoupled support payments having fossilised and then flattened payments and bear no resemblance to what you actually do on the farm in terms of driving efficiency or introducing innovation or whatever it might be. That separation is actually, in effect, those area-based payments have just incentivised inertia. And I think there's an opportunity here to move that away from those simple, blunt area-based payments, more to a focus on, as I say, recognising and rewarding what is good practice, best practice. And then not only would you have the innovation that, and experience that might come out through the comments from Pete and Kate there, but it's then about, you know, incentivising farmers to move into that space, because fundamentally doing those actions and unlocking that support payment is fundamental to underpinning their financial viability. And that remains critical. And particularly when you move into more marginal areas, that becomes more and more critical. But at the moment, we are building a system where we're expecting farmers and crofters to change, where support payments are absolutely rigid, rock solid and blunt. And I think we have an opportunity here. We have a huge opportunity.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Just a quick question on what you might think about regenerative agricultural methods like cover crops or no-till, low-till or agroforestry? How can that be made accessible to farmers and crofters across Scotland, and what impact does then that have on long-term profitability?
Kate?
I can't really comment on the tillage because we're not arable farmers and I'm not representing arable farmers here, but things like agroforestry, again, speaking from personal experience, we're a tenanted farm looking to plant some trees, had a grant funder in place, had the landlord's consent, we want to do it, but the grant doesn't cover the area that we want to put the trees in or the way we want to do it. So it's matching these sort of things up so that the people who want to do them can actually get access. You've then got, as a back of that, all the sort of legislation around tenancy, which obviously you're not going to go into here, but that again can affect how tenants do some of these things. So you've got to take that into account. Cover crops and things, farmers will plant them if it makes sense to them financially to do so, and if they're incentivised to do that, because, you know, why wouldn't you? Farmers follow these incentives if they can, and if they can't see a downside, then many of them will take that up.
Like cover crops like oats and things can help improve ground nesting birds, for instance, in areas, and black grouse, for instance, and so looking at those kind of other practices.
And I think you find that most farmers, for all that we're all business people and we're talking about money here a lot of the time, we love to see the animals on our farms, we love to see nature, we want to do what we can to promote that where it makes sense financially for us to do that.
Johnny and Pete.
Just to add very quickly, clearly under the Agricultural Rural Communities Scotland Act, there is an obligation on the Scottish Government to produce a code of practice on sustainable and regenerative agriculture. I think we need to tread with a degree of caution in the sense that must be a code of practice and no more. And it should be around enabling farmers and crofters to take up practices which will suit that code of practice and the outcomes that we're trying to get to, rather than that being, if you like, overly prescriptive. I think that would be, or could be, potentially very damaging if we start to prescribe what is regenerative practice in one place, because you could have two farms side by side and their requirements could be very, very different.
Yeah. Pete?
So some things that we want farmers to do are going to cost them more money than they're going to get in, but they deliver public goods. You know, so we pay them to do that, you know, and that's completely sensible. There's other things in terms of regenerative farming where in the longer term, you know, you're definitely going to come out more profitable than you went in, either because you've reduced your inputs or you've increased your outputs. You know, but getting better soil, mob grazing, agroforestry, a lot of these things will actually increase your bottom line and improve your bottom line, but they might not do it for 3, 4, 5 years. And the banks are starting to say, well, how can we support farmers through this transition phase? Government could equally be saying, you know, we have a scheme here. We can support you through the transition phase. Give us your 5-year plan, and we'll give you a bespoke payment to support you through that transition phase. There's lots more ways we can support farmers to make the transitions to regenerative models of agriculture, especially for the things which won't pay for themselves in year one.
Yes, I think it's pretty farm specific. I'm not actually pretty clear what regenerative is as a thing. You know, it's farming. How do farmers farm their particular farm? What suits the way they do it? I think Johnny touched on that. I think Pete's right. I think all the research that's been done shows that you know, if you start moving down some of these routes, your business is likely to go backwards before it goes forwards. That's a big barrier to get through in terms of a mindset. Yeah, and then I think more broadly, what help can we then give people to do that? You know, for example, on my little farm, I've planted diverse swards with chicory and plantain and stuff in it. I'm probably making a complete mess of it because I kind of know what I should be doing, but I don't. You know, I'm not sure I'm making a great job of it. So how do we get? You know, that's back to this point about sharing the knowledge, getting the knowledge exchange, and making sure that. But to make that work, I need to spend a fortune on infrastructure that I just don't have on a small farm.
I'm conscious that, Johnny, you potentially to get away at 11 o'clock, so please feel, we've got 2 questions left, but if you feel you need to get away, completely understand. I'm now going to move on to a question from Rhoda Grant.
Be as quick as I can. The National Adaptation Plan highlights how vulnerable agriculture is to climate change with flooding, drought, diseases and pests coming into the country. What's the impact if farming doesn't adapt, or adaptations not given significant priority, and what are the Scottish Government doing to help farming deal with those risks?
I mean, I mentioned it very much earlier on. Obviously, emissions reductions have been our primary focus and still are in many ways, but the sequestration piece is important. But going forward, adaptation is going to be critical. I mean, some of the extremes we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, and in fact, in 2023, we were pretty much burning up in June and then had horrific floods in October and caused all sorts of damage in different ways. So building resilience into agricultural businesses, particularly in our horticulture and veg and cereal growing areas as much as anywhere, I think is going to be critical. So investment in that area is important as investment anywhere else. How do we build more resilient businesses going forward?
Jim?
South West of Scotland, good grass area, Ruda, but we have to rely on the fact that we need to make enough winter keep silage to have cows in the house for 8 months. We can only rely on a 4-month grazing season now because of the type of change in the climate we've seen in the last 10 years. You don't get onto ground apart from in the last 2 or 3 weeks during the winter normally because there isn't frost to do anything. You don't get the frost crack in the ground. I've never seen so many fields panned. I've never seen so many fields poached, with all the soil structure issues and problems that brings with it. This time last year we were about to start lambing sheep, and some of the best ground we've got in the farm, I wasn't even able to travel with motorbikes or buggies. It was so wet. I have never seen anything like it, and I'm 64 years old. So farmers are having to adapt. Some of the older ones are just saying, I've had enough of it. I know people that left the industry last spring because they wouldn't face it again. And that's going to continue to happen. But it all falls to the same thing. You've got to have a plan. You've got to have a fallback position, and all of that requires investment. If you're going to make 8 months of storage for silage and 8 months of slurry storage alongside it, which is what we need, then that requires considerable capital investment. Therefore, the industry has to be profitable.
Okay, Pete and then Kate.
We know better soils make a huge difference. They're better with drought, they're better with floods. They really help. And so I think we need a chief soils officer in Scotland. We need to really pay attention to soils. Agroforestry, as Kate says, can help with some of the, water management on the farm. But yeah, we need to help farmers adapt to the new climate, and we also need to invest in glass houses so we can grow more of our stuff inside.
One of the things that hasn't been mentioned due to climate change is the change in animal disease patterns, and that's another thing that we absolutely need to be really clued up on, because diseases are going to come into the country that we haven't seen before. We need to have the right strategies in place to keep them out. We need the right strategies in place to make sure that we know how to deal with them when we get them. The other part of what, well, Scottish Government did announce some money for LiDAR and the work that we are doing on our baseline and farms. So LiDAR does, part of that is showing where things like runoff are, so that then farmers can make decisions to plant specific places to stop that runoff rather than not having that information. So they can have that information to know then what to do about it and how to adapt in the best way, so that they're not just kind of plucking things out of thin air.
Yeah. Evelyn.
Thanks, Convener. Climate change is obviously causing more and more storms. Recently we saw Éowyn. How are farmers dealing with this, and do they need support?
NFU Mutual are dealing with it in the main, putting new roofs on sheds, etc. As the Greens convener at Thornhill Golf Club in sunny Dumfriesshire, we're just tidying up the mess of another 80 or 90 trees following the 250 that came down 2 years past in November. And these are not things that have been planted in the last 10 years. Some of these have been there for over 100 years. I had the misfortune of driving from Dumfries to Ely and Fife on the 24th of January during that storm to have a very close friend's funeral, and I have never seen so much havoc wreaked in that distance. There was nowhere immune to it. So it's something we're going to have to get used to, and it's something not just farmers but everybody's going to have to get used to, and I don't think government intervention is the thing that's going to sort it. We're just going to have to make the best of it.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? Neil?
I think I would broadly agree in that. I think that when you get these types of storms coming, it's a limited amount you can do. Pre-warning of it coming helps, and actually I think this time maybe they got the pre-warning right, but we've had plenty where we've not got that, so people can get themselves prepared. But outside of that, I really don't know what else you could really do.
Investment again, modern infrastructure and farms. You need sheds that are up to date. You need sheds that are not 50 years old. You need sheds that are fit for purpose for 2025, for the next 25 years. And if that investment doesn't roll on, then farming goes backwards. If you don't have the investment to put cattle, for example, in sheds in a climate that's changing and being wet every winter, then cattle will continue to leave the country. And that's what's going to happen. So it's all about the same thing. You can have all the conversations about climate change, about emission targets you like, but unless businesses are profitable, they can't invest in the future of their own business, and they can't invest in the nice things to have, that, as they would see it, which are reducing emissions, which are improving efficiencies, etc., etc. It just doesn't happen. And back to my example about environmental schemes, if you're going to get involved in an environmental scheme, you have to spend money. We do it. We do it because we see good reasons for it, but there's got to be good financial reasons as well. Yep. And if you don't have the capital to invest, you won't do it.
Okay, Kate.
So just to go back to that storms question, the one thing that government or authorities could do would be to make it easier. So I was speaking to a friend last night who had a small shelter belt which basically came down during the last storm. Some of the trees are down, some of the trees aren't. They have another area of forestry which they currently have people in taking down, and they're trying to get a felling licence from Forestry Land Scotland to remove this small shelter belt, which is down anyway, and they've been told that the decision will take 3 to 4 months. Although the equipment is on the farm at the minute, they're not allowed to take the rest of it down. So just little things like that, which were, if ironed out, could make everybody's life so much easier when it comes to dealing with things.
Thank you. And our very final question, which might be the most important question of the day, Tim Eagle.
It up now. I'm not sure it is the most important question of the day. Better deliver it well. It's actually quite a specific question, actually, just around, and we've obviously spoken about where we're trying to get to in terms of emissions reduction targets, but in terms of the context of Scottish agricultural policy, are you confident that we've got the specific metrics, benchmarks, etc. in place to measure progress moving forward, or would you like to see more?
We don't. We absolutely don't. That's the whole point of this.
Yep. 5
years ago, the first priority we identified as a group, not about subsidies, was about efficiency and about sustainability and about whether it's emission reductions, climate change, you name it, was you have to have baseline data to work from. Yep. And we don't. And we don't have the capability of gathering it. And whole farm plans are all very interesting, but what are they trying to capture? A carbon audit is all very interesting, but what are you going to do with it once you get it? So information is power, and we don't have it. And even if we could capture it, who would be in charge of it? Where would it be stored? And how could you get access to it safely so that somebody else doesn't get their hands on it? ScotEID was set up to look after animal movements, has got involved in BVD as well, which is a complete shambles because their computer systems don't talk to each other. So who would actually perform that task is a complete unknown to me. We identified it 5 years ago of something that Scottish Government had to look at and come back with an answer, and as far as I'm aware, 5 years later we're still waiting.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we can't even agree what carbon audit tool we're going to use. So and they all spit out different numbers. So, and as Kate said then, whatever that number is, why is it different and how do we explain? I've done a carbon audit. I've got it. It tells me something, but I'm not sure what, because very few people can actually explain to you why has it come out this way. But if we can't actually agree the tools we're going to measure with, we're not going to get anywhere, right?
Thank you. I think it was Kate next.
Yeah, no, we aren't measuring anything properly. It's been said already, but we're averaging out things. We're using figures from the whole of the UK, or even worse, the whole of the world, to make calculations on things. Scottish Government are paying farmers through the PSF to do soil sampling. We're not aggregating that data in any way. There doesn't seem to be anything central to aggregate that in. Same goes for carbon audits. And the methodology to take it higher up, and not your concern really, but the methodology of calculating methane is completely disputed, I would say. The GWP 100 figure and the GWP star figure are very different, and there doesn't seem to be a general consensus. I know at the IPCC level they're still working on GWP 100, but there is a growing body of evidence which is saying that that's not the right way to calculate methane. And it could absolutely change everything we do. I mean, we saw just a few years ago peatlands as a whole going from a carbon sink to a carbon emissions in a huge way, just by the different way of calculating things. So we need to nail that down as well as a world, really.
Pete?
Yeah, I'd agree with Kate. I mean, it's been disappointing, I think, to ARIOB that we didn't use the Preparing for Sustainable Farming period to do some of this baselining and use a common carbon calculator, even if it's not perfect, and aggregate the results and have a data set we can work with. And as Kate says, a lot of these emissions factors are crude. So, you know, in lots of contexts, a cow is a cow, and small cows, you know, eat less, so they emit less methane, and we don't necessarily capture that. And we're always lagging, as I said earlier, so our data collection is always lagging behind. But even the smart inventory is not that smart. So what we need to do is to set really clear, ambitious targets 20 years out. You know, we need to halve emissions from agriculture, we need to double on farms carbon sequestration, and we need to maintain food production, certainly in terms of nutrients. And you know, so we can set those targets, and then we create some pathways to them. And we have to recognise that our measurement won't be week by week or month by month or year by year. It'll tend to be 5 years by 5 years, and recognise that that's part of the price we pay. But as long as we have good ideas about why the actions we're taking will lead to the changes we want to see, then we can progress on that basis.
Okay. Johnny?
I think Tim's question is critical. Absolutely, we need baseline data at farm level and then at aggregate level, but that then opens up another can of worms entirely. And it was referred to, touched on, data has a value. Data has to have a value from a farmer's point of view as well. And that then takes us into a big discussion about who has control of that data, and particularly around things like market access issues and so on. The supply chain, right the way through to retailers, has a huge interest in farm-level environmental data. And there's so much already being captured by them in many ways, rather than by the farms, and what we might want to use in terms of supporting and underpinning policy decisions. That's already happening. What we need is a system where we can join up so that data can be not pooled but shared, and it can talk to each other and all the rest of it, but we're still miles away from achieving some of that. So we've got lots and lots of data buzzing around, but farmers right now don't feel in control of their data. And that data does have a value, and it's very important.
Very quickly then, I guess, just to sum all this up in a yes or no, just to make it quick. 39% reduction by 2040. Are we on track to meet that, do you think, at this point in time? Yes or no? No.
Depends what you measure. The measurements are changing. You can't do a yes or no. There's been a significant reduction already because animal numbers are dropping. And if all the carbon and methane emissions were properly measured, which they're not, because they're not captured on the calculator at the moment, for example, in our farm, then that would make a significant difference to the number. So we've got another 14 years or whatever it is. You said 2039, did you say?
Well, 2040, isn't it?
2040. So we've got 15 years to A, figure out how the hell you measure it, B, figure out the measurement on farm.
Yep.
I've just got a good idea, Tim, in answer to your last question. Every June, farmers around Scotland are asked to fill in a paper form called an agricultural census that asks you such clever questions like how many tractors do you have, how many wheelbarrows do you keep, how many wheels do they have, and we fill in these forms assiduously because we're threatened with fines of up to £1,000 if we don't.
Yeah.
And then we've got the army of sheep counters that I referred to earlier. Why don't the Scottish Government reassign those officials to actually capturing information that might be some damned use to somebody, as opposed to sticking it in a report that nobody ever reads?
Thank you. Convener, sorry, just to declare an interest, I have got a small farm myself before somebody shouts at me later on. I've got to declare my interest.
Can I just add to that? I think the roadmap that we've recently worked with SAC on shows that we can get 31% with existing technology if we do all the right things. Yep. But we do need innovation and new thinking on how we're going to get there to actually achieve that higher figure.
Okay. Tim, can I ask the question, how many cattle do you assume we're still going to be there in 2040 with that 31% reduction?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, Jim.
Because that's the key to it.
Yeah.
Because they won't be here.
Okay, we're going to have to draw that to a close. Tim's declared an interest. I should declare an interest that I share something in common with Kate, is that my father and I were the UK silage making champions for the British Grassland Society back in the 90s. The first Scottish farmers to do it, so I had to get... Oh, well, there you go. But with that happy note, I would like to thank you all for your perseverance. That's been a tremendous session. I know we've run considerably over time, but that will help us in our further deliberations when we look at climate change in the future. So thank you very much for your attendance this morning. I now suspend the meeting for a couple of minutes just to allow the witnesses to leave. Thank you. Reconvene this meeting, but we move into private for agenda item 3. Suspend the meeting.